The Nexus Accord station hung in the void, like a crystalline monument to bureaucratic excess. Its 17 interlocking rings, spinning with the self-important precision of a cosmic timepiece that nobody particularly wanted to read. Every surface gleamed with bioluminescent panels, displaying scrolling texts in 437 languages, most of which translated roughly to "please wait in the designated queuing area." Inside the Grand Concordance Chamber, representatives from across the galaxy had gathered for what the official documentation euphemistically termed minor territorial adjustments and resource allocation discussions. In less diplomatic circles, which is to say anywhere honest beings gathered over fermented beverages, these were known as the Outer Rim Wars, a delightfully apocalyptic series of conflicts that had been cheerfully obliterating entire star systems for the better part of 3 centuries. The chamber itself was a masterpiece of form over function, designed by committee and built by the lowest bidder. Tiered seating arrangements spiraled upward in complex mathematical curves that supposedly represented the harmony of unified purpose, though they mostly succeeded in ensuring that roughly half the delegates couldn't see the central podium without developing neck cramps. Atmospheric processors hummed constantly, maintaining 17 different breathing mixtures, while somehow managing to make the entire space smell vaguely of bureaucratic resignation. At the chamber's heart, the ceremonial arbitration dais rose like an altar to inefficiency, embedded with crystals from extinct worlds and metals that required their own diplomatic immunity. It was currently occupied by Ambassador Vexthara of the Zephyrian Collective, whose 4 arms gestured with the kind of elaborate choreography that suggested either profound wisdom or severe neurological issues. The translator circuits struggled valiantly with concepts that roughly approximated synergistic paradigm enhancement through collaborative framework optimization, which everyone understood meant absolutely nothing but sounded impressive enough to fill the required speaking time. The morning's agenda, distributed on biodegradable data wafers that dissolved if not read within precisely 43 minutes, outlined 12 hours of ceremonial presentations before anyone would be permitted to mention actual territorial disputes. First came the ritual of acknowledged existence, followed by the ceremony of mutual recognition, then the traditional expression of diplomatic courtesy, and 17 other formalized wastes of time that had accumulated like bureaucratic sediment over millennia of galactic civilization. 2 power blocks dominated the proceedings, each maintaining the careful pretense that they weren't planning to carve up the galaxy between them the moment everyone else left the room. The Crystalline Hegemony occupied the chamber's eastern spiral, their delegation arranged in perfect geometric precision that would have impressed a mathematician and horrified anyone with a functioning sense of spontaneity. Every member wore ceremonial robes that changed color according to their precise rank in the hierarchy, creating a prismatic display that was either beautiful or migraine-inducing, depending on one's tolerance for organized perfection. Their leader, whose name required 3 separate vocal chambers to pronounce correctly, sat motionless as a statue while subordinates whispered updates through quantum-encrypted thought links. The hegemony believed in rules the way other species believed in gravity, as a fundamental force that held the universe together and should never under any circumstances be questioned. Across the chamber, the Void Consortium maintained their traditional air of mysterious menace, which mostly involved wearing dark robes, speaking in whispers, and cultivating the kind of dramatic shadows that required portable lighting equipment. Their delegation shifted and moved like smoke given form, creating the impression that they might simply dissolve into dark matter if the conversation became too tedious. Where the hegemony worshipped order, the consortium embraced the elegant chaos of controlled entropy, believing that power flowed naturally to those sophisticated enough to manipulate uncertainty itself. Between these titans, smaller species clustered in nervous hierarchies, each hoping that enthusiastic agreement with whoever seemed to be winning might somehow protect their homeworlds from being accidentally obliterated during the next phase of galactic restructure. The ceremonial proceedings had reached the traditional acknowledgement of historical grievances, when the chamber's main airlock cycled with a distinctly non-ceremonial hiss. Every head and several other appendages designed for observation turned toward the disruption. A figure emerged from the airlock with all the grace of a cargo hauler making an emergency landing, short by galactic standards, bipedal in the boring way of evolutionary simplicity, and dressed in what appeared to be functional clothing rather than ceremonial regalia. The newcomer surveyed the scene with the expression of someone who had just walked into an elaborate practical joke and was trying to determine whether to laugh or call security. The human, for that's what the being obviously was, despite the statistical improbability of their species caring enough about galactic politics to send a representative, carried a single data pad, a cup of what smelled like caffeinated plant extract, and an air of profound skepticism that seemed to lower the chamber's ambient pomposity by several measurable degrees. Without ceremony, fanfare, or apparent concern for the ritual of diplomatic introduction currently in progress, the human located an empty seat in the neutral observer section, sat down and began reading their datapad while sipping their beverage. The sound of liquid consumption echoed in the sudden silence like sacrilege in a cathedral. Ambassador Vexthera's forearms froze mid-gesture. The crystalline hegemony's perfect formation rippled with uncertainty. The Void Consortium's mysterious shadows seemed to solidify slightly, as if even controlled darkness found itself confused by such casual disregard for established protocol. The human looked up from their datapad, noticed several hundred alien stares focused in their direction, and offered a small wave that somehow managed to acknowledge the attention while simultaneously dismissing its importance. Then they returned to their reading, apparently fascinated by whatever mundane information commanded more respect than the greatest diplomatic gathering in galactic history. In the silence that followed, the elaborate machinery of cosmic bureaucracy continued its relentless spinning, but something fundamental had shifted. For the first time in recorded history, the Nexus Accord had encountered a being who seemed genuinely unimpressed by the magnificent theater of interstellar diplomacy. The Crystalline Hegemony and Void Consortium, titans of galactic civilization, found themselves united in a single unprecedented emotion, the creeping suspicion that their carefully constructed universe of protocol and procedure might not be quite as significant as they had previously assumed. The ceremonial expression of territorial concerns commenced 3 hours later, after the requisite intermissions for atmospheric adjustment, dietary accommodation, what the official schedule termed metabolic synchronization periods, a diplomatic euphemism for bathroom breaks that somehow required 47 minutes and 3 separate forms. Ambassador Crystalline of the Hegemony approached the central days with the measured precision of a geometric proof given physical form. Her presentation materialized in holographic splendor above the chamber, star charts that sparkled with mathematical beauty, resource allocation matrices that pulsed with algorithmic certainty, and territorial boundaries drawn with the kind of obsessive accuracy that suggested the universe itself should feel honored to conform to such elegant organization. Esteemed colleagues, she began, her voice carrying the harmonic resonance of someone absolutely convinced of their own reasonableness. The Hegemony's claim to the Vega Proxima sectors represents not mere territorial expansion, but the natural evolution of ordered civilization into regions currently suffering from an unfortunate lack of proper administrative structure. The holographic display zoomed in on 17 star systems, each labeled with efficiency ratings, productivity indexes, and improvement projections that painted a picture of benevolent conquest through superior bureaucracy. Inhabited worlds were diplomatically referred to as population centers requiring organizational guidance, while the fact that several of these worlds had been shooting at hegemony survey ships was delicately termed localized resistance to beneficial reform. The humans, still occupying their observer seat with the casual permanence of someone who had found a comfortable spot and intended to keep it, glanced up from their datapad just long enough to watch a particularly elaborate animation showing peaceful trade routes flowing through conquered administratively optimized space. They made a small notation on their pad and returned to reading, apparently finding their beverage more engaging than the mathematical justification for subjugating 14 billion sentient beings. When Ambassador Crystalline concluded with a flourish of geometric precision, the chamber abrupted in the traditional acknowledgement of presentation, a complex ritual involving synchronized breathing, harmonic resonance, and carefully timed appendage movements that took nearly 20 minutes to complete properly. The Void Consortium's response emerged from shadow like a philosophical argument given malevolent form. Speaker Umbrelthwen glided to the dais without appearing to move, their presentation manifesting as shifting darkness that somehow conveyed information through controlled absence of light. Where the Hegemony offered charts and calculations, the Consortium provided implications and suggestions, painting pictures of inevitable entropy that only they possessed the wisdom to properly channel. The sectors in question, Umbrelthwen whispered, their words carrying with the weight of distant stellar collapse, exist within natural patterns of decay that require careful guidance. The Consortium's stewardship would ensure that these regions achieve their destined transformation through controlled dissolution rather than chaotic entropy. The holographic darkness showed the same 17 star systems, but rendered as nodes in vast networks of shadow and possibility. Inhabited worlds became conscious matter requiring evolutionary acceleration, while the Consortium's military interventions were artistically presented as entropy management through directed phase transition. The underlying message was identical to the Hegemony's: we want this space and everyone in it, but wrapped in existential poetry rather than administrative efficiency. The human made another note on their data pad. This time, several nearby delegates noticed what appeared to be a small sketch of two children fighting over the same toy, complete with stick figures and crude motion lines. The artistic quality was questionable, but the metaphorical accuracy was disturbingly precise. As the traditional response consideration period commenced, 47 minutes of ritual silence during which delegates were supposed to contemplate the profound wisdom they had just witnessed. The human did something unprecedented. They raised their hand. The chamber's attention focused with the intensity of a solar flare. Raising one's hand during response consideration violated approximately 37 separate protocols, ignored the established hierarchy of speaking privileges, and demonstrated either profound ignorance of diplomatic procedure or complete indifference to civilized behavior. Quick question, the human said, their voice carrying clearly in the shocked silence. Are we talking about the same star systems? Because your maps show identical territorial claims. The statement hung in the air like an unexploded quantum torpedo. Ambassador Crystal Alexandra's harmonic resonance stuttered slightly, while Speaker Umbrelthwen's controlled shadows seemed to solidify with surprise. The territories in question, Crystal Alexandra replied with the careful precision of someone explaining basic mathematics to a child, represent natural spheres of administrative influence based on logistical optimization and cultural compatibility matrices. And the Consortium's claim, Umbrelthwen added, their whisper somehow becoming more ominous, follows inevitable patterns of entropic flow that transcend mere geographical boundaries. The human nodded thoughtfully, made another notation on their datapad, and asked, so you both want the same stuff but you're using different words to say it. The silence that followed could have been weaponized. Across the chamber, delegates who had spent centuries mastering the art of diplomatic doublespeak found themselves confronting a question so fundamentally simple that answering it honestly would require admitting that the last 6 hours of elaborate presentations had been an exceptionally expensive way of saying mine. The situation, Ambassador Crystal Alexandra began, her voice carrying slight harmonic distortion, involves complex factors that require careful analysis of multidimensional policy implications and strategic resource optimization framework. Also, added Speaker Umbrelthwen, shadows writhing with what might have been embarrassment, the patterns of cosmic inevitability suggest that traditional territorial concepts must be transcended through deeper understanding of existential necessity. The human took another sip of their beverage, looked at both speakers with the expression of someone watching an elaborate magic trick they had already figured out, and made a final note on their datapad. This time the nearby delegates could clearly see the words "same answer, more syllables" written in remarkably neat handwriting. Got it, the human said, settling back into their chair with the satisfaction of someone who had just solved a puzzle everyone else was pretending was still mysterious. So when do we get to the part where you figure out who actually gets what? The chamber remained silent, but the quality of that silence had changed. Where before it had carried the weight of diplomatic gravity, now it held the uncomfortable tension of several hundred highly educated beings realizing that their sophisticated system of interstellar negotiation had just been reduced to playground logic by someone who apparently viewed galactic civilization as a mildly interesting afternoon entertainment. In the Crystalline Hegemony section, perfect geometric formations began showing tiny irregularities as individual delegates shifted uncomfortably. Across the chamber, the Void Consortium's mysterious shadows seemed less dramatically meaningful, and more like an expensive way to avoid making eye contact. The human finished their beverage, glanced around the chamber with mild curiosity, and returned to their datapad as if the greatest diplomatic crisis in recent galactic history was simply background noise to whatever they were reading. For the first time in the Nexus Accord's illustrious history, the assembled representatives of galactic civilization found themselves wondering if perhaps their problems weren't quite as complicated as they had been pretending.
The mediation phase began with all the enthusiasm of a funeral for optimism itself. Traditional protocols demanded that neutral arbitrators facilitate discussion between competing claims, which in practice meant watching two immovable objects politely refuse to acknowledge each other's existence, while the universe continued its steady expansion around them. Ambassador Zenithar of the Peaceful Mediation Guild approached the central dais carrying the ceremonial staff of reasonable discourse, a crystalline artifact that supposedly enhanced rational thought, but mostly succeeded in making everyone speak more slowly and use longer words. His species had evolved specifically for diplomatic intervention, developing enlarged craniums for processing complex negotiations, and extra vocal chambers for producing soothing harmonics that could theoretically calm even the most heated territorial disputes. Esteemed being, Zenithar intoned, his voice carrying the therapeutic resonance of someone professionally committed to finding middle ground. Let us explore pathways toward mutually beneficial arrangements that honor both the hegemony's administrative excellence and the Consortium's philosophical insight. What followed was a masterclass in the art of saying nothing with maximum verbosity. The mediation process involved 17 distinct phases, each requiring separate ceremonial acknowledgements and procedural confirmation. Traditional wisdom suggested that patient application of established techniques would eventually produce workable compromise solutions, much like the ancient belief that sufficient prayer could eventually convince gravity to reverse itself. The Crystalline Hegemony presented their compromise proposal through holographic displays that sparkled with mathematical certainty. They would graciously accept administrative responsibility for 12 of the 17 contested systems, leaving the Consortium free to pursue their philosophical interests in the remaining 5 specifically. The 5 systems with the least strategic value and most problematic indigenous population. The Void Consortium's counteroffer emerged from shadows like a diplomatic mugging disguised as generosity. They would magnanimously assume the burden of guiding 15 systems through their inevitable entropic transitions, allowing the hegemony to maintain their orderly paradise in the remaining 2. Coincidentally, the 2 systems already under hegemony control and therefore not actually in dispute. Ambassador Zenithar's enlarged cranium pulsed with the effort of processing such reasonable proposals. Perhaps, he suggested with the desperate optimism of someone watching reality collapse around carefully constructed theories, we might explore subdivision arrangements that honor both parties' essential requirements. The human, who had been observing this exercise in mutual stubbornness with the detached interest of someone watching an elaborate dance performed by enthusiastic amateurs, finally looked up from their datapad. Has anyone actually asked the people living in these systems what they want? The suggestion hit the chamber like a philosophical brick through a metaphysical window. The concept of consulting affected populations was so fundamentally alien to established diplomatic procedure that several translation systems crashed trying to process it. Across the chamber, delegates began exchanging glances that suggested either profound confusion or the early stages of existential crisis. The indigenous populations, Ambassador Crystalexandra explained with the patience of someone addressing a particularly slow child, lack the administrative sophistication necessary for meaningful participation in galactic-level policy decisions. Besides, added Speaker Umbrothwen, their shadows writhing with what might have been condescension, conscious matter experiencing localized existence cannot perceive the broader patterns of cosmic necessity that guide proper decision-making. The human made another note on their datapad. This one appeared to be a simple tally mark under a column labeled "Missed the point." They looked around the chamber with growing comprehension, like someone finally understanding the rules of a game everyone else had been playing badly. So let me get this straight, they said, leaning forward with the expression of someone who had just discovered something fascinating. You're fighting over who gets to rule people who don't want to be ruled by either of you, in order to extract resources from systems that would probably be more productive if you left them alone, using military forces that cost more to maintain than the territories are actually worth. The mathematical precision of this summary created another one of those uncomfortable silences that seemed to be accumulating around the human like a diplomatic event horizon. Ambassador Zenithar's harmonics faltered as his enlarged cranium struggled to process logic that was both completely obvious and utterly devastating to everything he had been professionally trained to believe. The situation, he managed finally, involves complex interdependencies that require sophisticated analysis through established frameworks for. Right, the human interrupted. apparently having reached some internal decision. Here's what humans did when we had this problem. The chamber held its breath or equivalent respiratory pauses as the human stood up and walked to the central dais with the casual confidence of someone about to explain something very simple to people who had been overthinking it for centuries. We had these two groups fighting over territory. They continued pulling up their own holographic display with technology that was embarrassingly primitive compared to galactic standards, but somehow managed to show clearer information than anything previously presented. Each side claimed they had the right to rule because they were better at it. Sound familiar? The display showed a blue-green world divided by artificial lines, with symbols representing different territorial claims overlapping in hopeless contradiction. So we tried the traditional approach first. Negotiations, mediation, compromise solutions. Took about 300 years and several million casualties to figure out that wasn't working. Ambassador Crystalline's harmonic resonance developed a slight tremor. And what solution did your species ultimately discover? The human smile was the kind that made advanced civilizations suddenly remember why they had evolved flight responses. We asked the territories to decide for themselves. Turns out most places function pretty well when you stop fighting over who gets to boss them around. The holographic display shifted, showing the same territorial divisions, but now the different regions were highlighted in different colors, some choosing one side, some the other, many choosing neither. But the administrative efficiency, Crystalline protested, her voice carrying harmonics that suggested the approach of a mathematical nervous breakdown. The optimization protocols, the resource management frameworks, the inevitable patterns of cosmic order, added Umbrelthwen, their shadows solidifying with what was definitely panic. The entropic necessities that transcend individual consciousness. The human looked at both of them with the expression of someone watching two children argue over who got to be the boss of a game nobody else wanted to play. Yeah, funny thing about that. Turns out people are generally pretty good at running their own lives once you stop explaining to them why they're doing it wrong. Around the chamber, delegates began engaging in the kind of rapid, whispered consultations that suggested the sudden appearance of uncomfortable new ideas. The mathematical certainty of hegemony doctrine was developing cracks, while the consortium's philosophical inevitabilities were looking suspiciously like expensive ways to justify wanting other people's stuff. But surely Ambassador Zenithar managed, his professional mediation training, fighting desperately against the approaching collapse of everything he had been taught to believe. Galactic civilization requires coordinated oversight to maintain stability and prevent chaos. The human glanced around the chamber, taking in the elaborate ceremonial displays, the competing territorial claims, the hundreds of representatives who had spent 3 days accomplishing absolutely nothing except agreeing to disagree more expensively. You mean like this? They asked. In the silence that followed, the sound of galactic civilization reassessing its fundamental assumptions was almost audible. Somewhere in the back of the chamber, a minor delegate from a small trading confederation made what sounded suspiciously like a snort of suppressed laughter. The human returned to their seat, leaving behind a chamber full of beings who were beginning to suspect that their sophisticated system of interstellar governance might not be quite as inevitable as they had always assumed. The emergency consultation period that followed was not, technically speaking, part of the traditional Nexus Accord protocol. It emerged spontaneously when Ambassador Crystalline and Speaker Umbrelthwen simultaneously requested private conferences with their respective delegations, their voices carrying the kind of barely controlled harmonics that suggested imminent philosophical collapse. The Crystalline Hegemonies section erupted into geometric chaos as perfect formations dissolved into urgent clusters of whispered calculation. Their entire governmental structure was built on the mathematical certainty that superior organization inevitably led to superior outcomes, which in turn justified administrative expansion into regions that clearly needed better management. The human's suggestion that people might actually prefer managing themselves represented a logical paradox that threatened the foundational equations of hegemony existence. Across the chamber, the Void Consortium's mysterious shadows had solidified into something resembling panic with dramatic lighting. Their philosophy of guided entropy depended on the fundamental premise that conscious matter required sophisticated oversight to achieve proper existential transition. If beings could successfully navigate their own cosmic development, then the consortium's entire reason for existing, became approximately as meaningful as a philosophical treatise on the emotional states of hydrogen atoms. The human, meanwhile, had returned to their datapad with the satisfied air of someone who had just solved a puzzle that everyone else had been deliberately complicating. They appeared to be reading something about agricultural yield optimization in low-gravity environments, apparently finding crop rotation schedules more engaging than the existential crisis currently consuming galactic civilization's two greatest powers. Ambassador Zenithar stood at the central dais, his enlarged cranium pulsing with the effort of processing a diplomatic situation that had no precedent in the 17,000-year history of galactic mediation. His species had evolved specifically to find middle ground between competing positions, but nobody had prepared them for the possibility that the entire ground might simply dissolve beneath carefully constructed compromise. Perhaps, he suggested with the desperate optimism of someone watching their life's work evaporate, we might consider a trial period for localized self-determination, with careful monitoring to ensure proper developmental guide. The human looked up from their agricultural data with mild interest. You mean like asking permission to help instead of just showing up and helping whether they want it or not? The simplicity of this concept hit the chamber like a philosophical freight train. Several minor delegates began engaging in rapid consultations that sounded suspiciously like beings discovering that common sense had been hiding in plain sight for millennia. The representative from the Altarian Trade Federation actually stood up and began calculating how much money they could save by not maintaining occupation forces in territories that might actually cooperate if asked nice. From the Hegemony section came the sound of mathematical certainties being hastily recalculated. Ambassador Crystal Alexandra emerged from the consultation cluster with her harmonic resonance displaying distinct signs of frequency instability. The Crystalline Hegemony, she announced with the careful precision of someone reading from a script written by a committee in crisis, wishes to formally withdraw from territorial administration of the contested sectors, pending comprehensive review of our administrative optimization protocol. The statement was delivered in traditional diplomatic language, but everyone in the chamber understood what it actually meant. The Hegemony had just realized that their entire expansion policy was based on assumptions that might be mathematically elegant, but were practically ridiculous. Speaker Umbrelthwin materialized from the Consortium's shadow conference like a philosophical ghost delivering its own eulogy. The Void Consortium acknowledges that the patterns of cosmic necessity may require alternative We formally suspend our claims pending deeper meditation on the nature of consensual entropy management.
In less poetic terms, the Consortium had just discovered that their entire ideology collapsed the moment someone asked whether the people being guided through entropic transitions had actually requested guidance. The human made 2 more tally marks on their datapad and looked around the chamber with the expression of someone who had just watched 2 complicated machines break down when someone pointed out they had been assembled backwards. So, they said, apparently feeling that some form of acknowledgement was appropriate. Does this mean the shooting stops? The question hung in the air with the weight of several centuries of interstellar warfare suddenly rendered pointless. Ambassador Zenithar consulted his ceremonial chronometer and made a notation that would become historically significant. As of this moment, he announced, his voice carrying harmonics of bewildered relief, the Outer Rim conflicts are formally suspended pending direct consultation with affected populations. Around the chamber, the sound of galactic civilization reassessing its fundamental assumptions grew louder, as dozens of minor conflicts suddenly became irrelevant. The mathematical precision of the hegemony's expansion had been based on the certainty that they knew better than everyone else how things should be organized. The Consortium's philosophical inevitabilities had depended on the assumption that individual consciousness was insufficiently sophisticated to understand its own cosmic needs. Both assumptions had just been demolished by the radical suggestion that people might actually know what they wanted better than distant governments did. The human finished their agricultural data, stood up, and began walking toward the airlock with the same casual indifference they had displayed upon arrival. They paused at the chamber's exit and looked back at several hundred representatives who were still processing the fact that their elaborate system of interstellar governance had just been reduced to rubble by basic common sense. "Nice station," they said, apparently feeling that some form of farewell was socially appropriate. "Very impressive architecture. You might want to consider renting it out for conferences once you figure out what you actually need to conference about." The airlock cycled shut behind them, leaving the chamber in silence that was rapidly filling with the sound of empires reconsidering their purpose in the universe. 3 hours later, as news of the Accord's unprecedented conclusion spread across galactic communication networks, historians would note that the human representative had never actually intended to destroy two of the galaxy's greatest alliances. According to their filed reports, they had simply been curious about why everyone was making such a complicated production out of what appeared to be a straightforward property dispute. The irony was not lost on the few beings sophisticated enough to appreciate it. Galactic civilization's most elaborate diplomatic crisis had been resolved not through superior wisdom or advanced negotiation techniques, but through the application of logic so basic that most species had apparently evolved past the ability to recognize it. In the aftermath, as the Nexus Accord station continued its stately rotation through space, the bioluminescent panels still displayed scrolling messages in 437 languages. But now, instead of queuing instructions, they mostly showed variations on the same simple question that had changed everything. What do you actually want? The answer, it turned out, was usually something much more reasonable than anyone had been assuming.